Right now, in the southern Philippines, families who were displaced from their homes exactly 2 months ago are standing in line for cash assistance, and the ground moved beneath them again. This is happening in 2026. On Wednesday, August 5th, at just after noon local time, a shallow offshore earthquake shook the island of Mindanao, rattling windows, sending people running into the streets, and reopening a wound that had barely begun to heal. The United States Geological Survey placed the magnitude at 6. 3. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, the country's own earthquake monitoring agency known as PHIVOLCS, initially estimated it even higher, close to magnitude 7. 0, before revising the number downward to 6. 4 as more data came in. And here's the detail that has scientists paying unusually close attention to this specific event. It struck more than 8 weeks after the massive magnitude 7. 8 earthquake that devastated this exact region back in June, at a point in the sequence where aftershocks are supposed to be tapering off, fading into the background, becoming smaller and rarer with each passing week. Instead, this one arrived at nearly the same strength as some of the larger aftershocks recorded in the first days after the main shock. And it is not an isolated case. It is the latest entry in a pattern that seismologists studying this region are still working to fully explain. Today, we are going to break down exactly what happened on August 5th, why this earthquake is drawing scientific attention beyond the usual news cycle a moderate quake normally generates, what the geological history of this exact stretch of coastline tells us, and why Mindanao's position at the meeting point of multiple active subduction zones makes this one of the most seismically complicated regions on the entire planet. No exaggeration, no manufactured hysteria, just the mechanics, the history, and the honest scientific picture of what is actually happening beneath southern Mindanao right now. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me if you have ever experienced an earthquake aftershock sequence that lasted far longer than you expected, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why some aftershock sequences behave, the way physics predicts, while others, like this one, keep surprising the scientists studying them. If breakdowns like this help you actually understand the science behind a story instead of just scrolling past a headline, hit subscribe so you catch the next update the moment new data comes in, and a thumbs up genuinely helps this reach people who are living through this exact sequence right now and need accurate information rather than panic. Let us get into it properly. To understand why the August 5th earthquake matters, you first need to understand the event it is connected to, because this was never really a standalone story. It is chapter 4 or 5 in a sequence that began back on June 8th. That morning at 7:37 in the local time zone, a massive magnitude 7 earthquake struck offshore southern Mindanao, with the United States Geological Survey placing the epicenter roughly 25 kilometers southwest of the coastal community of Cablalan at a depth of about 57 kilometers. PHIVOLCS calculated a slightly different location and depth, placing it 32 kilometers south of Masim in Sarangani province at 21 kilometers deep, which is a completely normal kind of disagreement between agencies using different seismic networks and different modeling assumptions. But the overall picture both agencies agreed on was unambiguous. This was one of the strongest earthquakes to strike the Philippines in decades. PHIVOLCS attributed the rupture to subduction activity along the Cotabato Trench, the same fault system responsible for the catastrophic Moro Gulf earthquake back in 1976, an event that killed roughly 8,000 people and remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in Philippine history. The June 8th earthquake left at least 106 people dead across Mindanao, injured more than 1,300 others, and left 7 people missing, numbers that would eventually climb as recovery operations continued in the weeks that followed. It also triggered a tsunami warning that reached across the Sulawesi and Celebes seas into Malaysian waters, with authorities in Sabah urging coastal residents to move to higher ground and reporting unusual sea level changes along the eastern coast, even though the region ultimately avoided major tsunami damage. Malaysia's prime minister also publicly pledged support for the earthquake-hit Philippines in the days that followed, a reminder of just how far the shockwaves from a magnitude 7, 8 rupture, both literal and diplomatic, can travel across a region as tightly interconnected as maritime Southeast Asia. What makes the June 8th earthquake specifically relevant to understanding what happened in August is what occurred in the minutes and hours immediately following the main shock. Within approximately 80 minutes of the initial magnitude 7, 8 rupture, the same general area was struck by a cluster of additional strong earthquakes, a magnitude 6, 1, a magnitude 6, 0, and a magnitude 6. 5, essentially a rapid burst of major aftershocks stacking on top of each other before the ground had any real chance to settle. That kind of immediate aftershock burst is not unusual on its own. Large subduction earthquakes routinely trigger clusters of significant aftershocks in the hours right after the main shock, as the surrounding fault segments adjust to the sudden redistribution of stress. What is far less typical is what happened next. because this sequence simply refused to follow the normal decay pattern seismologists expect. On June 26th, more than 2 weeks after the main shock, a magnitude 6, 5 aftershocks struck the same general region. On July 14th, more than 5 weeks out, a magnitude 6. 2 events followed, its epicenter located just 19 kilometers from where the August 5th earthquake would eventually strike. And then, on August 5th, more than 8 full weeks after the original rupture, the magnitude 6, 3 to 6. 4 events arrived, hitting the community of Sarangani directly and reaching an intensity of 5, described as strong shaking in the coastal town of Glan, an intensity level capable of waking sleeping residents, rattling windows, and shifting objects off shelves. To understand why the persistence of this sequence is drawing scientific attention, you need to understand the basic physics of how aftershock sequences are supposed to behave. Because there is a well-established mathematical relationship seismologists use to describe this exact process. It is called Omori's law, named after the Japanese seismologist who first documented the pattern back in the 1890s. And the basic principle is straightforward. The frequency of aftershocks following a major earthquake decreases roughly in proportion to the time elapsed since the main shock. In practical terms, this means you would typically expect the first day after a magnitude 7. 8 earthquake to produce dozens of aftershocks, the first week to produce noticeably fewer, and by 2 months out, the sequence should have thinned dramatically, with any remaining aftershocks, generally smaller in magnitude and far less frequent than what was recorded in the opening days. That is the pattern that plays out after most major earthquakes around the world, a rapid initial burst followed by a steady, predictable decline, like a bell slowly stopping its ring after being struck. What makes the Mindanao sequence worth flagging is that 8 weeks out, the fault system was still capable of producing an earthquake in the same magnitude range as several of the significant aftershocks recorded in the opening hours, rather than the smaller, quieter tail end Omori's law would typically predict by this point in the timeline. There is a reasonably well-understood scientific explanation for why some aftershock sequences behave this way instead of decaying smoothly, and it comes down to the concept of stress transfer across a fault system that has been described by researchers using a model called Coulomb stress change. When a massive earthquake ruptures one section of a fault, it does not just release the stress stored in that specific patch of rock, it also redistributes stress onto the surrounding fault segments, sometimes pushing neighboring sections closer to their own failure point, and sometimes actually relieving stress in other nearby areas, depending on the precise geometry involved. Researchers studying past Mindanao earthquake sequences have documented exactly this kind of behavior before, describing situations where one significant earthquake transfers enough stress onto a neighboring patch of the fault system to essentially load the gun for a subsequent independent rupture weeks or even months later, rather than that later event functioning as a simple decaying aftershock in the traditional sense. When a fault system is this geologically complex, involving multiple adjacent fault segments and, in Mindanao's specific case, multiple entirely separate subduction trenches sitting close together, the resulting stress interactions can produce a sequence that looks less like a single earthquake fading into silence, and more like a chain of related but genuinely distinct rupture events, each one capable of triggering the next as stress migrates from one patch of the fault system to another. This is where Mindanao's specific geology becomes essential to understanding the bigger picture, because this island does not sit near a single fault the way many earthquake-prone regions do. It sits at the convergence point of multiple active subduction zones simultaneously. The Philippines as a whole occupies one of the most tectonically complicated pieces of real estate on Earth, positioned at the intersection of the Philippine Sea Plate, the Sunda Plate, and the Eurasian Plate, with the added complexity that the archipelago features subduction systems facing in opposite directions on its eastern and western sides, an arrangement that is genuinely unusual even by the standards of tectonically active regions. Mindanao specifically is bordered by 3 separate active subduction trenches. The Cotabato Trench, responsible for both the 1976 Moro Gulf disaster and this year's June 8th main shock, the Philippine Trench running along the island's eastern coastline, and the Sulu Trench further to the west. Phaivolgs documents an average of roughly 20 earthquakes striking somewhere across the Philippine archipelago every single day, a staggering figure that reflects just how constantly active this entire region truly is, even though the overwhelming majority of those daily events are far too small to be felt by anyone at the surface. When you have this many independent fault systems packed into such close geographic proximity, the potential for one system's activity to influence, trigger, or interact with a neighboring system increases significantly, which is exactly the kind of interaction researchers suspect may be playing a role in why this particular aftershock sequence has proven so persistent. It helps to compare Mindanao's tectonic situation to somewhere like California or Japan, to really appreciate how unusual this level of complexity actually is. A place like the San Andreas fault system, despite its own considerable complexity, is still fundamentally organized around a single dominant type of fault interaction, the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grinding past each other horizontally along one connected system. Japan sits at the convergence of 4 separate tectonic plates, which is itself considered an extraordinarily complicated setting by global standards, and is part of why Japan experiences such intense and frequent seismic activity. Mindanao's situation, though technically involving fewer named plates directly, achieves a comparable or arguably even greater degree of local complexity because of how many independent, actively slipping trench systems converge within such a geographically compact area, each one capable of generating its own major earthquakes largely independently of the others, yet close enough together that stress transferred by a rupture on one system can plausibly influence the loading on a neighboring one. Scientists studying this region have likened it to a crowded intersection where multiple busy roads meet without clear traffic signals, each fault segment moving according to its own separate set of rules, but constantly at risk of influencing the others in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict in advance. It is also worth addressing the discrepancy in how different agencies reported the August 5th earthquake, because it is a genuinely useful window into how earthquake science actually works in the immediate aftermath of an event, rather than being any kind of sign that something was being hidden or mishandled. The United States Geological Survey's early estimate placed the magnitude at 6.3, with a shallow depth of roughly 10 kilometers. The European Mediterranean Seismological Center calculated a similar magnitude, but a considerably deeper focus, around 35 kilometers. Fivolks, meanwhile, initially estimated the earthquake at a much larger magnitude 7.0 before revising that figure down to 6.4, as additional seismic data arrived and allowed for more precise calculations, while other reporting placed the depth even deeper, around 62 kilometers, which would help explain why no tsunami warning was issued for this particular event, despite its offshore location, since a deeper focus earthquake distributes its energy across a larger volume of rock before it reaches the seafloor, generally producing less of the sudden vertical seafloor displacement that triggers a tsunami compared to a shallower rupture of the same magnitude. This kind of variation between agencies is completely routine in the first hours after any significant earthquake. Different networks of seismometers, positioned at different distances and angles from the epicenter, combined with different automated processing algorithms, will almost always produce slightly different initial estimates, and those estimates typically converge toward a more precise, broadly agreed upon figure over the following hours and days, as scientists manually review the waveform data, rather than relying purely on automated first-pass calculations. Global and national agencies use different seismic networks, models, and revision processes, and the gap between a 6.3 and a 6.4, or even the wider gap between an early 7.0 estimate and a later 6. 4 revision reflects the genuine difficulty of instantly pinning down a precise number in the first minutes after a rupture, rather than any failure of the underlying science or the people working around the clock to interpret it. The human impact of the August 5th earthquake, according to official reporting so far, has thankfully been far less severe than the devastation caused by the original June mainshock, with no casualties reported from this specific event. But the timing carries its own particular cruelty that goes beyond the raw physics of the earthquake itself. The quake struck while displaced survivors from the June disaster were gathered at distribution sites collecting emergency cash subsidies, more than 95,000 residents across the affected region, still unable to return home 2 full months after the original catastrophe. According to the latest consolidated figures from the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council, the June 8th earthquake left 94 people dead, 1,316 injured, and 18 still missing as of official reporting, with a broader assessment from the Department of Social Welfare and Development finding that nearly 1.7 million people across 650 barangays in the Zamboanga Peninsula, the Davao region, the Sox-Sargan region, and the Bangsamoro Autonomous region were affected in some capacity. Of that number, over 95,000 people remain displaced as of mid-July, with roughly a third of them still living in 80 separate evacuation centers, and the rest staying with relatives or friends, unable to return to homes that were destroyed or damaged. Government figures documented more than 121,000 damaged houses across the affected region, including over 19,000 structures destroyed outright and more than 102,000 partially damaged. Homes that, in many cases, remain structurally compromised, weakened by the initial main shock in ways that are not always visible from the outside, but that make them significantly more vulnerable to any subsequent shaking, however moderate. That vulnerability is precisely why disaster response officials have emphasized that structural clearance work across the affected region has become more urgent rather than less, as this aftershock sequence continues, not less. A building that survived, a magnitude 7, 8, earthquake without visibly collapsing, is not necessarily a building that has escaped serious structural damage. Cracked support columns, weakened foundations, and compromised load-bearing walls can all remain standing after a major earthquake, while carrying damage significant enough that a subsequent magnitude 6 class shock, which under ordinary circumstances might cause only minor additional cracking, becomes genuinely dangerous, potentially pushing an already weakened structure toward collapse. This is exactly the kind of compounding risk that makes an extended, unusually persistent aftershock sequence like this one especially concerning to engineers and emergency planners, even when any single event within that sequence would not, on its own, be considered a major disaster. Every additional magnitude, while a 6-class shock striking the same weakened building stock, effectively resets the clock on how much confidence anyone can have in preliminary damage assessments, which is why structural engineering teams working across the affected provinces have had to treat this recovery effort as an ongoing moving target rather than a fixed timeline they can simply work through and complete. This dynamic also creates a genuinely difficult resource allocation problem for disaster response agencies operating in the region, one that rarely gets discussed in coverage focused purely on the earthquake itself. Engineering teams conducting structural assessments across hundreds of barangays cannot simply clear a building once and move permanently onto the next one, since a subsequent aftershock can undo the confidence behind an earlier clearance, meaning inspection teams are effectively working through a rolling, ever-expanding backlog, rather than a finite list that shrinks steadily toward zero. Local governments have had to balance this against the practical reality that displaced families cannot remain in evacuation centers indefinitely, both for capacity reasons and for the psychological toll of prolonged displacement, creating genuine pressure to clear and reopen homes as quickly as responsibly possible, even while the underlying seismic activity continues to introduce fresh uncertainty into exactly how quickly that clearance process can safely proceed. This tension between the urgency of getting people home and the caution demanded by a still active fault system is one of the quieter but more consequential aspects of disaster recovery in a region experiencing this kind of extended aftershock behavior. And it is a challenge that does not resolve itself simply because news coverage of the original main shock has faded. It helps to understand the historical backdrop against which this entire sequence is unfolding, because the Cotabato Trench, the fault system responsible for both this year's main shock and the devastating 1976 Moro Gulf earthquake, carries a particularly grim legacy in this exact stretch of the southern Philippines. The 1976 event, which struck with a magnitude in a similar general range to this year's main shock, generated a tsunami that swept across the Moro Gulf coastline with little to no warning, given how limited seismic monitoring infrastructure and public alert systems were at the time, killing an estimated 8,000 people and remaining, to this day, one of the deadliest natural disasters in the nation's modern history. The fact that this year's magnitude 7, 8 event is already being described by seismologists and disaster officials as the Philippines' strongest earthquake since that 1976 catastrophe, and specifically along the very same trench system, underscores just how significant this particular fault has been in shaping the region's disaster history across 2 separate generations. The 50-year gap between major ruptures on the same trench also tells you something important about how these subduction systems accumulate stress over time, a pattern broadly similar to what researchers have documented on strike-slip fault systems elsewhere in the world. Long, quiet stretches where relatively little happens at the surface while stress slowly builds at depth, punctuated by comparatively rare but catastrophic release events when that accumulated stress finally exceeds what the locked fault segment can withstand. It is also worth putting the scale of the June 8th main shock into perspective, using the same kind of energy comparison seismologists apply to major earthquakes anywhere in the world. The magnitude scale used by international agencies is logarithmic, meaning each whole number increase represents roughly 31 times more energy released, not simply a proportionally larger shake. A magnitude 6.3, the size of the August 5th event, already releases energy in the general range of a very large industrial explosion. A magnitude 7.8, the size of June's main shock, releases dramatically more than that, several hundred times more energy than the August aftershock, which helps explain why a rupture of that scale was capable of killing over 100 people and displacing more than 1.5 million, while the August event, despite still being strong enough to be felt clearly and to rattle windows across several provinces, caused no reported casualties. Understanding that gap in scale is important context for anyone trying to gauge how worried to be about any individual event within this sequence, since even a genuinely significant magnitude 6 class earthquake remains a comparatively minor release of energy next to the main shock that preceded it by 2 months, even when it shares many of the same surface characteristics, the same general location, and even some of the same unsettling unpredictability. What makes the current situation scientifically distinct from a typical post-earthquake recovery period is this specific question of whether the ongoing sequence of magnitude 6 class events represents a genuinely unusual pattern of stress redistribution across Mindanao's tangle of subduction trenches, one that could continue producing significant earthquakes for months to come, or whether it simply represents a longer than typical but ultimately ordinary tail end of aftershock activity that will eventually taper off in line with the broader patterns Omori's law predicts. Researchers studying comparable sequences elsewhere in the Philippines have documented similar situations in the past, including a well-studied case off the eastern coast of Mindanao in December 2023, where a magnitude 7. 4 mainshock produced a sequence of aftershocks with unusually varied fault mechanisms, a mix of both compressional and extensional faulting patterns that researchers ultimately linked to the presence of an old, extinct oceanic fracture zone buried within the subducting tectonic plate itself. A kind of ancient geological scar in the ocean floor that complicated how stress redistributed itself across the surrounding fault network. That earlier case is a useful reminder that unusual aftershock behavior in this specific region is not without precedent, and it often traces back to genuinely complex, sometimes historically ancient geological structures buried within the subducting plate that are not always immediately obvious from surface-level earthquake catalogs alone, structures that scientists frequently only fully understand well after the fact, once enough seismic data has accumulated to map out the underlying pattern. There's also a growing role for community-level seismic monitoring in helping scientists piece together exactly this kind of complex regional picture, something that has become increasingly relevant across the Philippines in recent years. Networks of low-cost, privately owned seismometers, operated by individual citizens and universities, and shared openly with the broader research community, have begun supplementing the official government-run monitoring networks in various parts of the archipelago, providing additional data points that help researchers reconstruct the precise timing, depth, and mechanism of smaller events that might otherwise fall through the cracks of a sparser official network. This kind of citizen science approach does not replace the specialized expertise or equipment of an agency like FIVOLCS, but it does provide meaningfully denser coverage in exactly the kind of geologically complex, densely faulted region that Mindanao represents, where understanding subtle variations in how stress moves from one small fault segment to another can make a genuine difference in reconstructing why a sequence like this one has behaved the way it has. Over time, as more of this supplementary data accumulates alongside the official record, researchers expect to have a considerably clearer picture of exactly how Mindanao's 3 converging subduction trenches interact with one another during a major sequence like the one that began in June. For residents across the affected provinces of southern Mindanao, and honestly for anyone living anywhere along an active subduction zone, the practical guidance emerging from this sequence is not fundamentally different from standard earthquake preparedness advice, but it does carry additional urgency given the specific circumstances on the ground right now. Structural inspections of any building that experienced significant shaking during the June mainshock should be treated as an ongoing priority rather than a box that gets checked once and considered complete, since a structure cleared as safe in June could have sustained additional hidden stress from subsequent aftershocks that only becomes apparent under closer, repeated inspection. Emergency kits, including water, food, medication, and basic supplies, remain just as important during an extended aftershock sequence as they were in the immediate aftermath of the mainshock itself, since a moderate but unexpected shock arriving 8 weeks after the fact can just as easily disrupt access to shops, clinics, and clean water as an earlier one might have. Communities near the coastline should continue to treat any earthquake felt as strong shaking as a cue to move toward higher ground as a precaution, even when official tsunami warnings are not immediately issued, given how much uncertainty still exists in the first minutes after any offshore earthquake regarding its precise depth and mechanism, the 2 factors that ultimately determine tsunami risk. And for families still living in evacuation centers or with relatives after losing their homes in June, mental health support alongside physical safety planning deserves genuine attention, since an extended, unpredictable aftershock sequence like this one places a very real and cumulative psychological burden on communities already coping with displacement and loss. On top of the physical disaster, response work still very much underway. There's a particular kind of psychological toll that comes specifically from an aftershock sequence that refuses to follow the expected pattern of gradual decline, one that disaster psychologists have documented in communities recovering from other major earthquakes around the world. When aftershocks fade quickly and predictably in the days after a mainshock, communities are generally able to begin the psychological process of moving from acute crisis response toward longer-term recovery, even while the physical rebuilding continues. When a sequence instead keeps producing significant, felt earthquakes at seemingly unpredictable intervals across weeks and months, that transition becomes considerably harder to complete, since every relative calm can be interrupted by a fresh reminder that the underlying hazard has not actually passed. Aid organizations and local government units operating across the affected provinces have had to factor this reality directly into how they structure ongoing support, recognizing that recovery in a region experiencing this kind of extended, scientifically unusual aftershock behavior looks meaningfully different from recovery after a more conventional earthquake sequence that tapers off cleanly within the first month or two. Stepping back from the details of this specific sequence, there is a broader lesson here about how earthquake science actually works. And it is a useful corrective to the way major earthquakes tend to get covered in the days immediately following a main shock, when public attention is highest and then fades rapidly once the initial shock passes and news cycles move on to other stories. The reality on the ground for communities living through a major subduction earthquake is that the disaster does not end when the main shock stops shaking, and it does not even reliably end when the first wave of aftershocks tapers off in the days that follow. For a fault system as geologically complex as the one running beneath southern Mindanao, genuine recovery and genuine safety require sustained attention across months, not days, precisely because the underlying physics driving events like the August 5th earthquake are still being actively studied and are not yet fully understood by the scientists closest to this specific case. That is not a comfortable message, and it is certainly a less viral one than a single dramatic headline about a catastrophic main shock, but it is the honest one, and it is exactly why continued monitoring, continued structural inspection, and continued public communication from agencies like FIVOLCS and the USGS matter just as much 2 months into a disaster as they did in its opening hours. This is ultimately a story about the gap between how disasters are covered and how disasters actually unfold on the ground. A single catastrophic main shock generates enormous global attention for a few days, international aid pledges, extensive news coverage, and widespread public sympathy, before the news cycle inevitably moves on to the next major story competing for attention. The slower, messier reality of an extended aftershock sequence, one that keeps reopening partially healed wounds across the same communities for months afterward, rarely receives anywhere near the same level of sustained coverage, even though it arguably demands just as much ongoing attention from the people actually responsible for keeping affected communities safe. Southern Mindanao's experience since June 8th is a genuinely useful case study in exactly this dynamic, a region that made international headlines for several days in early June, and has largely fallen out of global conversation since, even as the underlying seismic hazard has continued producing significant felt earthquakes well into August. We will be watching closely for whatever comes next in this sequence, whether the frequency and magnitude of aftershocks along the Cotabato Trench finally begins, the more typical decline Amori's law would predict, or whether this pattern of periodic magnitude, 6-class events, continues for weeks or months longer, and whether ongoing research into the specific stress interactions between Mindanao's 3 surrounding subduction trenches produces a clearer explanation for why this particular sequence has proven so persistent. If this breakdown helped you understand the real science behind a story that easily could have been reduced to just another scary headline, share it with anyone you know who has family or connections in the southern Philippines. Drop a comment letting me know your thoughts on how communities can better prepare for aftershock sequences that stretch on far longer than expected. And subscribe so you catch the next update the moment new data comes in from this region. This is a sequence that is still actively unfolding, and understanding exactly why it has behaved the way it has is the first real step toward helping the communities living through it prepare for whatever comes next.